Hi, time for another story. Tonight, we're going to talk about Clara Barton. You might have heard the name Clara Barton, and if you haven't, it's time you learn. This is kind of a long story, so settle in, rest up, and here we go. Miss Clara Barton, a quiet little old lady, used to tell stories of her childhood among the hills of central Massachusetts. She remembered how she was taken to the village school for the first time. She remembered how the teacher, a tall, kind-looking man, put her in the spelling class with the smallest children and said, "You need to learn to spell dog and cat." "I don't spell there," said Clara. "I know how to spell artichoke." Whoa! That small 3-year-old turned the leaves of her spelling book until she came to a page of 3-syllable words, and the first one was artichoke. The teacher had to hide a smile from the small girl, 3 years old, reading and spelling such long words. Clara was very fond of her handsome big brother. "My brother David was the Buffalo Bill of that part of the country," she said. "It was his delight to take me, when I was 5 years old, out to the field. He would take a couple of young horses and gather the reins of both bridles in one hand, and throw me on the back of one colt. Then he would spring me on the back of the other one. He would bid me, 'Cling fast to the mane.' Then we would go galloping away over field and fen, in and out among the other colts in wild glee. Those were merry rides we took. This was my riding school. I never had any other, but it served me well. To this day, my seat on a saddle on the back of a bare horse is as secure and tireless as sitting in a rocking chair. I found it, and still do, far more fun than riding in a rocking chair. Sometimes, in later years, I found myself suddenly on a strange horse in a trooper's saddle, flying for life or liberty, and I blessed those baby lessons and wild gallops I had. By the words "riding for life on a strange horse in a trooper's saddle," Miss Clara Barton meant her life as an army nurse. Sometimes she found herself in great danger when the enemy's cavalry was close behind. At the age of 11, Clara had her first chance to learn how to be a nurse and fit for her life work. Her brother David fell from the ridgepole of a large barn he was helping build. The shock of this fall made him ill in mind and body. He wanted no one near him but the brave little sister that he had taught to ride like the wind. Clara stayed with her big brother day and night for 2 long years. She was 13 before he was well again. Miss Barton told the story long afterwards of that strange feeling she had. "I was free again. My work was done. I wondered that my father took me to ride so much, and my mother hoped she could make some new clothes, for in those 2 years I had not grown even 1 inch. My shut-in life made me very bashful. I had grown timid, shrinking and shy in the company of others. I was even afraid of giving trouble by making my wants known. Instead of feeling that my freedom gave me time for play, it seemed to me it was nothing more than time wasted, and I looked about, anxious to find something useful to do. Concerned, the family sent Clara away to school, hoping she would overcome that shyness. She studied very hard, and at the age of only 15, she graduated and became a school teacher. There were not very many public schools in those days. This was 25 years before the Civil War. The only free schools were looked down on well-to-do people as those charity schools. Well, Clara Barton began to teach in one of those, where she had only 6 very poor children to teach. But she was such a good teacher that before long, 600 pupils came under her charge. She tried so hard to help everyone she could. At the end of 18 years of service as a teacher, she almost died and she lost her voice. She still could not bear to be idle while she had the use of her hands. Her handwriting had always been plain and neat, and so she decided to try to find a job, and she was placed in the patent office in Washington. Clara Barton was one of the very first women to ever work for the United States government. This made the men in that department extremely mad. In those days, people thought it was wrong for a woman to work in an office, and the men just stared at the new clerk. Some said, right in her hearing, that such a woman was not fit to work with gentlemen like themselves. Timid and shrinking though she was, Miss Barton kept on. She was soon given a position of trust, and it was not long before she found out that some of the very men who had been insulting her were selling government secrets. Her duty to the country made her report those wrongs that those gentlemen had done. They were fired. During the year, oh, and this is a picture of the men. During the years of her life as a government clerk, Miss Barton was thrilled reading stories in the newspaper about Florence Nightingale. Now, Florence Nightingale was the famous nurse in the Crimean War between Great Britain and Russia. It was said that the English soldiers adored Nurse Nightingale almost as if she were an angel from heaven. Some of them even would kiss at her shadow as she walked by. When Fort Sumter was fired on and President Lincoln began calling for soldiers to defend the country, Clara Barton was soon found right at the very front in places of very great danger. She would fix up a house or an old barn for a hospital, and then would go on the battlefields just looking for wounded men. She herself did that alone. She was trying to relieve and help those men. She ministered to the dying and wrote many a last letter to the sorrow ones at home. She did wonders in getting medicines, hospital supplies, and comforts for those sick and wounded brothers in the army. She was made lady manager of all the hospitals at the front in Virginia. Those who knew most about her great work said that her services to the country were wider reaching even than those of Florence Nightingale, the greatest nurse the world had ever known. Suddenly, the grateful soldiers began calling her, Clara Barton, the angel of the battlefield. During the last weeks of his life, President Lincoln sent for Miss Barton. He asked her to undertake the difficult task of finding out, in as many cases as possible, what had become of the thousands of soldiers reported missing from the Union Army. At this memorable meeting, the great heart of the White House stood face to face with one of the greatest-hearted women in the world of that day. Well, Clara Barton spent 4 years more tracing out the fate of thousands of missing men. To her great joy, she learned thousands upon thousands of those who had been reported as deserters had actually given their lives for the country. Miss Barton then went to Europe to rest and regain the health. She was very sick from overwork. While in Europe, she studied the work of the Swiss, who were trying to find a new society for nursing and caring for the sick and wounded soldiers of all nations. Because it had a red cross on a white background for a badge and flag, it was named the Red Cross Society. It's just the opposite of how the Swiss flag looks. When war broke out between France and Prussia, Clara Barton again became known as the Angel of the Battlefield of France. After she returned to the United States, she began to organize the Red Cross Society, which has since become the greatest power in the world for relieving suffering. Wherever calamity or pestilence existed, there was Clara Barton. Although she was an old woman, she was always the first to come and the last to go. She was everywhere. She worked in Michigan during the forest fire. She worked in Charleston, South Carolina when the earthquake came. The Johnstown flood in Pennsylvania brought Clara Barton right there. In her spirit, the Red Society is ever ready to relieve suffering. Though Clara Barton turned 77 years old in the year of the war with Spain, she was active in sharing the hardships of the American soldiers in Cuba. She nursed Roosevelt's Rough Riders along with the rest of the sick and wounded at the front. Miss Barton lived to be over 90, honored and beloved by millions for her constant labors of love and mercy. No woman in all history has done more to relieve and heal the sufferings of mankind. The millions upon millions of men, women, and children now numbered in the membership of the American Red Cross are carrying on the work begun by this frail, sickly, bashful little girl whose yearning hearts and busy hands gave her the name Angel of Mercy. And that's a story also in one of my Best in Children's books that was published, and I received it in 1959. I hope the story wasn't too long, and I hope you never forget the story of Clara Barton. Even when she was sick, no matter what happened, she kept doing good for others. And that's a really good way to live. Good night. I love you.